Hello, everybody. Welcome to a Higher Business Series. I'm Kylie Ingram, the CEO of Wizer, and I'm coming to you from Bundjalung land. And I would like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. My guest today has spent decades developing leaders inside some of Australia's most complex organisations. She's led diversity, equity, and inclusion at two ASX 10 companies, Telstra and Macquarie Group. She's advised boards and executive committees and been where consequential decision gets made. She's led global teams through complex transformation and chaired diverse steering committees, advisory boards, and working groups. In 2024, Kylie founded Fuller Potential, a boutique leadership and DEI consultancy, working with organisations such as Telstra, BHP, and the National Reconstruction Fund. Kylie Fuller and I've come together today, not just as two Kylies, but because Wizer is built on the research of Dr. Juliet Burke, and part of that research is about the role of inclusive leaders. Kylie has worked extensively with Juliet and has seen for herself that cognitive diversity is unlocked when leaders actively create the conditions for people to speak up. Kylie, it is fantastic to have you here and join us this morning. We at Wizer obviously have applied Juliet's cognitive diversity framework into our decision science and technology, while you have applied it in real organisational settings without that tech layer. So tell us, how has this played out for you and your clients?
Thanks for having me, Kylie, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. I'm a huge believer in the power of cognitive diversity, and I have been lucky enough to work closely with Juliet in a number of different sectors in organisations, including the RBA, Telstra and Macquarie Group. In fact, we had a whole section, a whole module in Macquarie's Director Leadership Program based on diversity of thought and the different thinking styles. So I've worked with large groups of leaders and seen how they interact with this content. And it really resonates with lots of different people across different sectors. I also use it with my Fuller Potential clients. So I do a variety of work, and some of it is with leadership teams and intact teams, and really emphasising to them the importance of tapping into the collective intelligence of the group has been something that resonates really strongly with different leaders in different contexts.
Nice. And when you say you can see them kind of leaning in, are there any, I see it, when we're talking to leaders, are there any phrases or how do you catch them to get them, because cognitive diversity can be quite an obscure thing, can't it? So how do you grab them?
One activity which has worked really well is actually to put posters with the different thinking styles around the room and then take them through a bit of an immersive experience where they tap into their dominant thinking style and then get them to stand next to the poster that represents that dominant thinking style. So you kind of get this very real human graph of the different thinking styles that are present in a group of people. And it's been fascinating to see how much that differs within organizations. So my dominant style is to think about people first. And sometimes I find myself as a bit of a lone ranger standing next to the people poster. And you see lots and lots of people, particularly at senior levels, standing next to outcomes and options. So it tells us a lot, not just about who gets recruited in large organizations, but also who gets promoted and what gets rewarded and what's important.
And Juliet's research showed that 75% of CEOs are those outcomes and options orientated people in Western society. So that makes sense. So tell us about
what have you my own eyes.
As you've stood there lonely. What have you learned about diversity and decision making in organizations? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Diversity absolutely improves decision making. I don't think there's any doubt about that, because it unlocks that collective intelligence, it broadens perspectives, reduces the risks of biases and assumptions. So, if you have a brain, you have bias. We all bring biases into our decision making. And by having cognitive diversity, we bring different biases and we are able to surface them and challenge them and mitigate them. what I've seen repeatedly in leadership teams that feel stuck is that it's not about intelligence, it's not about not understanding the work or the strategy or the priorities. The issue around stuckness is often that people don't feel able to challenge constructively, to bring in that new thinking. So they have different ideas, they just don't have a safe environment where it's okay to challenge the status quo because it can be seen as disrespectful. So I really strongly believe that inclusive leadership is commercially important because it affects decision quality, but also innovation and execution. And I think the best leaders know this instinctively. I've heard it over and over again. One of the biggest moments in my career was that 3 weeks after I started at Macquarie Group, I conducted a live stream interview with Shamara Wickramanayake around International Women's Day. And she was really emphatic about the fact that diversity of thought is one of the biggest strengths of Macquarie. So as the CEO, she would have to make tough decisions and she would have to stand behind them, especially with investors and stakeholders. But she rarely made those decisions without broad consultation. There was always that desire to have that cognitive diversity, those different perspectives taken into account before the final decision was made. And it was funny, a few weeks after that, she was interviewed by the AFR and they were asking her about her leadership. And she said, people see me as like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, sitting in my little office and pulling levers and making all these big decisions. But the reality is that my most important role is to empower the thousands of people who work here to work together to come up with ideas and execute them. So it's a really powerful example of just how important this work is.
Yeah, it's funny how many leaders you come across that think leadership is about making the captain's call, whereas the best leaders are designing those decision rooms, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, there are times that you do have to make a captain's call, but in my opinion, those times should be the exceptions. And if you're consulting and engaging broadly, when you do need to make those captain calls, they're still informed by diverse perspectives and diverse engagement.
Yeah, the CEOs that probably need us most want us least. But one of the things I find resonates with them is I say, well, how do you delegate with certainty? And then they start to think through, well, how does the information come to them and who's being silenced? Or, that's when they start to think about it. Let them make the captain's call, but at least think about how it's coming to them. So where do you think
sorry, Kylie, but delegation is so much easier when you have buy-in as well. So if people haven't been involved in the thinking and the decision making, and then a task is delegated to them without the context and without contribution, then they're far less likely to put in that discretionary effort. So I think it's a tool for delegation as well.
Yeah, definitely. And where do you think most organisations commonly go wrong in their diversity efforts?
Look, I think the challenge is the focus on composition rather than culture. So some of that is driven by reporting. So ASX listed companies have to report on gender representation. Lots of organisations have reconciliation action plans and accessibility actions plans. And they're metrics driven, which is important, right? It's important for accountability. But the representation needs to be just the starting point. It's not enough just to go out and recruit a diverse workforce and then expect that it's going to solve all the problems, challenge the groupthink. That's absolutely not the case, because when you bring diverse people into a homogenous culture, they quickly learn what gets rewarded and what gets promoted, and they know that fitting in matters more than speaking up, and it also feels a lot more comfortable. So when you have people who are real outliers within a group, very different to others, they sometimes feel like they have to cover or mask aspects of their own identity, and that creates its own cognitive load. I've heard it described as it's like wearing a suit of armor, and it gets heavy. So the longer you have to sort of cover things or work to fit in or not bring your true self into the conversation, the harder it gets to generate new ideas and to challenge.
And that silence speaks volumes, doesn't it, when people start to silence themselves?
Absolutely.
So what do you think separates those high-performing teams from teams that struggle?
Look, the research is really clear on this. The best teams, the most high-performing, effective teams, have an environment where both challenge and alignment coexist. So they're very clear on their shared goals, their priorities, and they trust each other enough to have some difficult conversations. They are able to challenge ideas without attacking people. So there's that high level of respect, and they're able to stay focused on that collective purpose and the outcomes rather than protecting individual territory. So it's competing together towards the common goals rather than that internal competition, which can really erode team cohesiveness. So I've seen really intelligent leadership teams underperform because people stop saying what they thought. And actually, I was running a masterclass yesterday with some leaders from a really large organization, and I asked them what it would mean for them if they had more psychological safety and inclusion in their team. And a couple of people said, no more dirty yeses, where people say yes, but they really mean no. They pretend to be on board, and no more watermelons. So they use this red, amber, green traffic light system, and they were telling me about this. The watermelon is when it looks green on the outside, but it's really red on the inside because it's stalled because people aren't bought in and they don't want to make it happen. So I think intelligent teams, high-performing teams avoid those scenarios.
Yeah, a dirty yes sounds a lot worse than a dirty martini.
Yeah, or an honest no. So
yes,
that's what
exactly.
you want to get to. If people disagree, if they're not bought in, if they don't think something's going to work, it's better that they can honestly say that than just say yes for the sake of keeping the peace, and then it starts to unravel when it's too late.
And Kush is right. Turning metrics into culture is can be a big shift rather than. And I think that's one of the things, isn't it? Juliet talks a lot about the biases that come with every decision. Leaders like to use their guts, but we've all got bias. We've all got bias, and one of the important things is to understand what they are and how to get them out of the way when you're making a decision.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's often said that if you have a brain, you have bias. So it's not a case of removing our biases, it's a case of mitigating them. And one of the best ways of mitigating your own biases is to hear from others, because they'll also have biases, but their biases won't be the same as yours. And so if you have that open culture where you can challenge one another, you surface the biases, you take them from being unconscious to being conscious. And once you're conscious of them, you can find ways to mitigate.
Yeah. So what does inclusive leadership look like day to day? What do you see?
Look, there are lots of different models. Juliet has an excellent one, the 6 signature trays. But I think at the heart of it, what I've seen most is inclusive leaders are truly curious and truly humble. They value input from others. They invite challenge. They listen without defensiveness. And they're willing to be a bit vulnerable and say, look, I don't have all the answers. I might be missing something. Tell me more about what you think about that. And I think those small moments really set the culture, and they set the scene as to whether people stay silent, they feign agreement with those dirty yes, or whether they actually bring their best thinking, and whether they speak up and they challenge and contribute ideas. And it's really ironic because there's so much effort that goes into talent attraction, making great decisions, bringing diverse talent into organizations, and then the organization is paying for people's expertise. But if you then have an environment where people are self-editing, second guessing themselves, staying quiet when they have something important to contribute, you're paying a whole salary, but you're only getting a fraction of that person's capability or contribution. So it's definitely not a good economic decision, let alone a cultural one.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? After you've gone to all this trouble and then you don't want to hear from people, whether it be their expertise or there's a bit of a rub cognitively against what you're doing. And I think we hear from people, oh, but this will take longer, whereas that's also been disproved. You know, you can give an hour for both tasks and structure your team well, or let it rip and the outcome's better here, and you've still spent an hour deciding. But yeah. And also we know decisions get made before they get into the room too, don't they? So there's all these things that you've got to make sure that you're taking that into consideration. So how do leaders create psychological safety without lowering the standards? And I guess this plays into some of the arguments they have with us when talking about it.
Look, I think Professor Amy Edmondson is the expert here, and many people who've joined us would be familiar with her 2x2 matrix, which shows that psychological safety, accountability, and standards are really interrelated. So safety is about creating the conditions where people have permission for candor, they can speak up, they can admit mistakes, ask for help. So really that helps with accountability, because accountability is about holding those high standards. It's about follow through, it's about feedback, having honest conversations when things aren't working, but also celebrating when things are going right and making sure that we are, rewarding ownership. We're rewarding people who are challenging things and making things happen. So psychological safety definitely is not about lowering standards. It's about creating a platform for that productive discomfort, that productive environment where people can really talk about what's getting in the way of their effectiveness. And sometimes some of the best insights come from the edges, not from the middle. So by having that psychological safety, you will hear from those that don't always get a voice.
Yeah, our first example was with a foundation, and we tripled the amount of research money we did that year. And really that case study is just, getting to the edges. We know that the edges are where true innovation lies, whereas often the board is seeing the same thing over and over again and they like to pick it. So tripling funding was, a really strong way of showing that you need to listen to be on the edges. And of course, you're right, human brain is wired to take the shortest route. And, especially if you've got a lot on, you often default to the comfortable, don't you?
Absolutely. I think our biases come out most strongly when we're under pressure, and we often are under pressure in the workplace because there's a lot to do.
Yeah. And so what role do you think diversity does play in leading change?
Look, I think this is such an important question because change is a constant right now, and change doesn't affect everyone equally. So one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen leaders make over the years when it comes to leading change is designing for people rather than with them. I think inclusive design is an absolute game changer, and the earlier that you engage a diverse group into designing a change, the more likely it is that you will surface some of the risks, you'll build better solutions, and you also create that ownership and that buy-in that we talked about, because people support what they help shape. So if they feel as if they've been listened to, if they feel like they've got a bit of skin in the game, then they also have a role in making sure that the change is successful. So I've definitely seen that in complex transformations, inclusion isn't a bolt-on. It's very much part of the execution, and it's one of the things that determines success. And I saw this incredibly strongly in the Metro Martin Place project team. So they had a huge project on their hands, and they knew that there were really different stakeholder groups. So some people were very excited about it, some were neutral, didn't even know about it, others were dead against it. And so they consulted very extensively, not only with experts of all sorts, so engineers, artists, Aboriginal landowners, accessibility experts, but also with ordinary people, so people that would be just using the space and experiencing the space. And because of that broad consultation, what they've come up is incredibly inclusive, it creates an amazing user experience, and people who were part of the change journey were far more engaged because they could see their contribution in the outcome, and they were far more willing to kind of ride out the bumps and the delays and the things that inevitably happen in projects like this. So it really reinforced something that I've seen over and over, that people support things when they feel like they've had an opportunity to shape them.
Yeah, Juliet was also saying they don't even necessarily need to be first person in the decision. If they can see somebody else that has their same cognitive style in that decision, they think, oh yes, well, my opinions have been heard because, you know, that person is thinking like me, which also helps that buy-in.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Juliet's the expert.
That sounds like a really a huge project you work on. Well, you must have come up with seen some really interesting stats around that as well. Was there anything that stood out?
Look, I was only involved at the periphery. I'm sure there are stats around it, but like even just now to use it, I went into the city last night to see a show at the Opera House and caught the metro with some people who hadn't been to the metro station before, and they were just absolutely blown away. So I think that the universality of the experience of just what an amazing facility this is, for everyone who uses it is kind of the main metric that you need.
And you do a lot, obviously, around human-centered design. How are you using that to unlock demographic and cognitive diversity? What do you, but maybe start for those that don't understand what human-centric design is, start there and build out from there.
Yeah, so human-centered design is sort of a philosophy of designing things around human needs, but it's also a set of tools and techniques that you can use to create products, services, innovations. And one of the great things about human-centered design is that it teaches you to design for humans, but not just the majority. They have this concept of extreme users or edge users. So, and what you find in human-centered design is that sometimes some of the best insights come from those extreme users. So people whose experiences or needs sit outside the mainstream. When you listen to those people, you uncover different needs, risks, and opportunities that those of us in the majority groups might miss. So I've actually used this a couple of times, and I've got a couple of really good examples. So when we designed the global DEI strategy at Macquarie and also at Telstra, actually used human-centered design techniques to engage with different people from all around the world. So made sure we had that cultural diversity, people of different genders, ethnicities, sexualities. We included people with disabilities and neurodivergent conditions, people with caring responsibilities, and also there are people that didn't have those things. So really trying to get that full diversity of experience to make sure that we understood it from different people's perspectives. And it was so interesting because we thought we had such a broad and diverse group involved, and that the first exercise, we asked them who the strategy would actually serve. And we were really surprised that they were really emphatic that it's not just about all of us, even in all of our diversity. It's not just about employees or candidates, but also our clients, our suppliers, members of the community, our foundation partners. So they looked at it through such a broad perspective, and the strategies that we've come up with have been so much richer because of that. And they opened up new possibilities of what we would do as part of that strategic work. I also saw a great example of this at the Reserve Bank. So one of the things that the Reserve Bank does, which not everyone knows about, is they produce the banknotes, so the currency. And when they were designing new currency for Australia, they heavily engaged with different groups. And one of the most important groups was people with visual impairments. So, which has led to these amazing banknotes that have tactile features that engage, that enable people with vision impairments to be able to distinguish between the different currencies. But what's really interesting is it also led to currency which is much less vulnerable to counterfeit. And in fact, Australia produces currencies for other nations now because the currencies that we have created here are so unique and distinctive. They have amazing features. So that's a really good example of where human-centered design, engaging with extreme users, has led to something that not only meets the needs of those users, but lots of other users, and had positive flow-on effects for the whole business.
Yeah, the the Australian notes when you're overseas are always an icebreaker. If you need something when you're just meeting people, people love it, don't they? They just love looking at our notes. Kush says, I would love to merge creative design techniques with human-centered design. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think creativity and human centricity have, a big overlap. And so you can use human-centered design to engage people in creative thinking, creative idea generation, prioritization and problem solving. So there's a really rich pool of tools and techniques that you can tap into to drive creativity.
Yes, well, I think that's exactly what you're saying. You're saying there's so much that can be done. So we're keeping it sharp and short this morning, so you guys get the most bang for your buck. But what's one thing leaders can do tomorrow, Kylie, to help them with?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I've just been talking about massive projects with big budgets and long lead times. And so sometimes it can feel like inclusion happens in big moments, but the reality is that inclusion happens in the day to day. So I guess one thing that almost any leader could do starting tomorrow is think about how you show up to your next team meeting. So, do you show up with humility, with curiosity? Do you ask questions? Do you invite contribution and model that fallibility? So asking simple, curious questions like, what else should we consider? Who else should we ask? And then really listening, because I think, the primary act of inclusion is listening, being open to diverse perspectives. And when leaders resist the urge to speak, it's amazing how much comes up and how much more empowered people are. So it's really about creating space instead of filling it, and building that culture in small moments where people trust that their perspective is really valued.
I love that, building that culture in small moments. And what I think, one of the advice we give when people are like, well, beside using the technology, what we can do, and we're like, leaders should speak last, make sure because we know with wise crowd science too, one of the biggest ways of derailing is a lack of independence. So the more independence you can provide a decision group, the better it comes. But I love that last phrase. Is there anything else we can leave our viewers with this morning?
Look, I definitely encourage people to dive into the research. We're so lucky. We live in an age of extreme complexity, but we also live in an age where there's just so much incredible information about how to lead self, lead others, lead teams, and would really just encourage everyone to look at the research. Juliet's got some really amazing papers, old and new, and it's some of the older ones have really stood the test of time, and I still use them in my work all the time. And look, I feel, look into Wizer as well, because you can just, I guess one of the challenges of implementing this has been that we haven't always known how to find the cognitive diversity that we're looking for. So it's a new tool. It's a new way of doing that.
Thank you. I'll pay you that fee later. I really thank you for joining us today and sharing your wealth of knowledge. There's so many things that, we've just scratched the surface, and, reach out to Kylie if you want to dive in further and check her out at Fuller Potential. But Kylie Fuller is on LinkedIn. It's the easiest way to reach you. Is that right? So
yeah, absolutely.
If you're serious about building high-performing culture and leadership capability and stronger team dynamics, you can find her on LinkedIn and, run with her knowledge and experience is what I would say. And thank you for joining us this morning, Kylie. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone else who joined us too.
Yes, as always, thank you, Kush, for being our super viewer. Okay, have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.